This narration will guide you through exercise 7 of our Anatomy and Physiology Laboratory Manual on the integumentary system of the skin. The next recording will cover bone tissue, a little bit about bone tissue. So this will allow you to see what I want you to know about skin, and it's particularly the histology of skin as a way of reinforcing some of the skin structures and functions. This cartoon includes a representation of pretty much all of the features of skin that I would like you to know about. It's not drawn to scale. There's a terrible issue there, but as far as the content, it has all kinds of important structures. The epidermis is the keratinized stratified squamous epithelium we talked about when we looked at all the different tissues, and that's all in orangish yellow here. And the tissue underlying it, as you know, because it underlies all epithelia, is loose areolar connective tissue proper, or just areolar tissue. And in this case, it has its own special name. It's called the papillary dermis. So this is the part of the dermis that's open in its weave of collagen fibers, contains lots of blood vessels, capillaries to feed the avascular epidermis, contains nerve endings, contains white blood cells to defend the body against invasion by microorganisms if the epidermis is nicked or damaged. Typical areolar connective tissue. Deep to that lies a very, very thick layer. As I said, this is not to scale at all. A very, very thick layer of dense, irregular connective tissue proper. And this part of the dermis is called the reticular dermis. So heavy-duty collagen fiber bundles crisscrossing every which way that give the skin its mechanical strength. So the epidermis is the seal. The areolar papillary dermis is the feeding and defense, feeding the epidermis and defense, and then the reticular dermis is the mechanical strength. All right, so there's a few appendages we'll be looking at noticeable in here. The hair follicles, those are like little factories that produce the hair shaft, which is just a flexible stalk of dead keratinocytes. The follicle also has associated with it some glands, sebaceous glands. Those are oil glands that lubricate and soften in your skin. And eccrine sweat glands are exocrine glands that produce sweat, and the sweat emerges through ducts onto the surface of the skin. The erector pili muscle, that's a little swath of smooth muscle cells that can tip a hair follicle such that the hair stands straight up. The hairs actually emerge from the surface of the skin at an angle typically, and then when the erector pili muscle contracts, it stands up, bunching up the tissue behind it, causing a so-called goosebump. There's sensory receptors in the skin that are depicted here. You see some sensory nerve endings, dendrites, or receiving antennas, if you will, of neurons. Here in the papillary dermis, some extend right up into the epidermis. Pacinian corpuscles are a type of sensory receptor deep down in the dermis. Let's see if it's written in here. They're called lamellar corpuscles. Here you can see the layers of collagen fibers, but we're going to call them Pacinian corpuscles, P-A-C-I-N-I-A-N corpuscles. And there's a lot of extra blood vessels in here to allow for vasodilation to bring hot blood from deep in the body right near the surface so that we can radiate more heat and evaporate more heat out of the body, under conditions of sweat, of exercise, right, when a lot of extra heat is being produced, or when the ambient temperature is very high. Here's a micrograph of the epidermis. Let's look at that first. The epidermis is this keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, and in this micrograph we can see the basal layer. So I'm just telling you that because They could have actually included a little bit more of the papillary dermis, wouldn't have hurt. Anyway, this is part of the papillary dermis where all the blood vessels are and so forth, areolar tissue. And here's the basal layer of keratinocytes in the epidermis. That's where stem cells lie, immortal cells that, as they divide, produce highly mitotic cells that divide and produce all these layers of cells, the architecture of the epidermis. And when once the cells are dividing here in the basal layer, daughter cells keep getting pushed up into the superficial layers, and as they do so, they begin to change or mature. Differentiate is the term more often used. So once the cells detach from the basement membrane here, that thin but dense mat of proteins that epithelia secrete, then they begin to change. The spinous layer is the name of this next layer, and it's also called a layer of prickle cells because the desmosomes in this layer become very, very prominent, and they form like what looks like little spikes around the perimeter of the cells. If you look very, very carefully, you can see all these little dots where the so-called prickles or spikes of the cells where they join together gives this its name, the spinous layer. So the cells are changing already. And then as we continue superficially, the next layer is called the granular layer. And you can see in this micrograph, as you would in any stained micrograph of epidermis, you can see some dark specks or dark blobs in the cells. And those are called granules or vesicles. There's two kinds of granules in these cells in this layer. They're making up some stuff and storing it in granules that are going to be important for the last moments of construction of the protective part, the actual protective layers of the epidermis. So anyway, there's two kind of granules. One contains very tough keratin proteins that are going to form the cytoskeletal interior of these finished dead cells out here. And the other kind of granules are called lamellar granules, and they contain waxy lipids that will end up being excreted or secreted, and they will saturate all the layers of cells exteriorly here and waterproof the whole thing. So that's what's in those granules. So keratohyalin granules with cytoskeletal proteins, lamellar granules full of waxy lipid. And then the cells die, and as they're doing so, they quickly exocytose the waxy lipids, and they fashion a very densely packed, impervious, tough, resistant to degradation cytoskeleton of specialized keratins and some other structural proteins that form essentially what's called an envelope around each cell's inner surface or inner membrane. The membrane disintegrates, all the organelles disintegrate, and the cells are still anchored together by desmosomes. So we wind up with layers and layers of dead keratinocytes packed with keratin cytoskeleton, joined together by desmosomes and slathered with waxy waterproofing lipid. So that's the actual finished product. All this epithelium here is a factory to generate the stratum corneum, the cornified layers, which are the actual functional barrier of your skin, the exterior surface of your body. It's resistant to microbes, bacteria, fungi, and so forth. It's resistant to chemicals. It protects you against water loss. It keeps the water inside your body. Otherwise, the water would just weep out of your body and you wouldn't be able to maintain your fluid volumes. So that's the epidermis. This cartoon just goes through the same things, but it draws in some things that are pretty hard to see in here that we should probably mention. Melanocytes are in the basal layer along with stem cells and transit amplifying cells, the fast dividing daughter cells of stem cells. And the melanocytes produce pigmented melanin. Melanin is a brown pigment typically. There's also an orangish yellow colored melanin that some very, very light-skinned people produce. Anyway, melanin is produced by the melanocytes in response to their genetic predisposition and ultraviolet light. And they ship out vesicles full of melanin to all the keratinocytes in the region. And so they help color the epidermis. And the reason for that is that the melanin is a UV absorber. It absorbs ultraviolet light that would otherwise potentially damage the chromosomes of these basal cells of the epidermis, the growing cells. We don't want changes in the genetic code and cells that are dividing and producing daughter cells. That's how skin cancers arise. We see here also in the basal layer Merkel cells, which are a specialized sensory cell. We won't notice them in the microscope so much, but just so you know, there are some sensory cells in the basal layer of the epidermis, which in conjunction with a specialized dendrite of a sensory neuron produce a sensitive touch receptor. And there are dendritic cells in the epidermis, phagocytic immune white blood cells that can move around in the epidermis, and they're the first responders. If we nick the epidermis and some bacteria get in here, they'll recognize it, engulf it, kill it, and then report on it to the lymphocytes of the immune system. Here's a nice micrograph that shows you some skin. You can see the epidermis here, the dark colored. All this stuff is epidermis. You can see the granular layer and a thin amount of stratum corneum on the outside. The granular layer is kind of a navy blue almost color there. The basal layer has lots of melanocytes. This would be very rich brown skin, and those melanocytes are producing the melanin and then passing it around to all the keratinocytes in the basal layer and in the spinous layer and so forth. Here is some thick skin. This skin is just probably some typical skin. This title says histology, and it lists some skin slides that we're going to look at. It doesn't mean that this slide encompasses all these things, okay? So this is thin skin right here, in which there's not very many layers, keratinized layers of the stratum corneum or cornified layer. But this skin is thick skin, typical of your soles of your feet and the palms of your hands. There are many, many layers of the cornified layers. All of this is dead keratinocytes that are waterproof and impervious to digestion by bacteria and so forth. So this is thick skin. You can see the granular layer here with all its little granules inside the cells, which give it this darker staining characteristic. Thick skin also has an extra layer that wasn't mentioned in our previous listing out. That's called the stratum lucidum. Thick skin has like a transparent few layers of keratinocytes just at the point where the keratinocytes die and start forming the keratinized layer. Down here we see the papillary dermis, areolar connective tissue. I'll take another look hopefully at that in a bit. Interestingly, the epithelium has no blood vessels and is fed entirely from the papillary dermis with oxygen and nutrients. When you place weight on part of the body against a hard surface, it squeezes down the blood vessels and the blood flow is interrupted in the region that's being pressed down. Say, if you're sitting in a chair right now, part of your skin on your posterior is not getting good blood flow, as well as some of the muscle probably there. And what happens is, as hypoxia ensues, there's not enough oxygen in some of those tissues, you become uncomfortable and you shift your position. All night long when you're sleeping, you continually shift your position to restore blood flow to areas of your body that aren't getting enough blood flow momentarily. However, if someone is incapacitated by some disease condition and they're lying in bed, for example, they need assistance. It's still just as important to move their body on a regular basis, every few minutes actually, in order to make sure that the tissues get enough blood flow. Absence of sufficient movement will cause the epidermis to die. And here's an ulcer. It's called a place where the epidermis is no longer covering the surface of the skin. And so that's the result of not enough turning. It's called a decubitus ulcer. And it can happen typically on the heels, the tailbone, the shoulder blades, parts of the body that sort of stick down and where there's bone near the surface, and where the body weight when someone's lying in bed will press and squeeze out the blood. There are a number of appendages in the skin, and one of them is shown here. The nails are a really interesting appendage of the skin. They're actually constructed of dead keratinocytes with a different type of keratin than the epidermis has in its stratum corneum or cornified layer. Other than that, it's very, very similar to the epidermis. So here we see the nail matrix. The nail matrix is equivalent to the basal layer of the epidermis. It's where the dividing cells are located. And the dividing cells, as they produce more and more offspring, give rise to the nail. And again, hard keratins are produced, so that when they assemble into the cytoskeleton of these cells, they produce a hard finished product as they dry and come out onto the surface. Very interesting. Similar but slightly different keratins. And then we have a nail bed by which this structure is anchored to the areolar or connective tissue beneath. And the nail is, as I'm sure you know, traveling distally from the nail matrix, and where it reaches the extremity of the soft tissue beneath it is called the hyponychium. That's the tissue just at the distalmost part of the epidermis here, where it contacts the nail. The hyponychium, right? The eponychium is this boundary between the epidermis and the emerging part of the nail. The first part of the nail that sees the light of day right here, that little unusual, there's like a little tissue difference there. It's called the eponychium. The root of the nail is the nascent part, the early just forming part of the nail coming out of the nail matrix. So a very interesting structure indeed that allows us to have fine manipulation capabilities with our digits, as well as protecting the ends of the digits with this hard plate of dead keratinocytes. Another appendage of the skin is the hair or hair follicles. The hair follicle is a factory to produce the flexible hair stalk or shaft. And if we home in on the hair bulb, the part of the follicle where the hair is growing, we see a layer of cells analogous to the basal layer of the epidermis. Incidentally, this is a modification of the epidermis. You can see that it kind of flows right from the epidermis. So anyway, the basal layer is recapitulated here, and there are stem cells and transit amplifying cells here in the hair matrix, which is again also analogous to the nail matrix. And so these cells divide and produce all the cells that become the hair shaft, which eventually die just like in the stratum corneum, and produce yet another type of keratin that is a hard keratin, much like in the nail, but it's more flexible. And so all these cells are just keratinocytes packed with a particular keratin that's characteristic of hair. It's also very, very durable, and hence hair, when it falls from the body, can survive in the environment for a very, very long time. Also in the hair matrix are melanocytes, which give the hair its color. The more melanocytes there are in the hair matrix, the more pigment will be embedded in the hair shaft as it forms, and the hair will be colored. Or if there's a very few melanocytes, or a melanocyte that produces a yellowish orange type of a pheomelanin, yellowish color, you'll have blonde hair as opposed to brown hair or black hair. So anyway, the hair itself, the hair shaft, has different regions, and the outer part of the hair shaft, this lighter area here, is called the medulla, which is just a common anatomical term to represent, the cortex, forgive me, which represents the outer part of an organ or a structure, and then the inner medulla, the core of the thing. So the outer part of the hair shaft has a boundary of cells called the cuticle. It's the outermost layer of cells on the surface of what will become the hair shaft. And then there are a couple of regions called the root sheath of the hair. And part of the root sheath arises from fibrous connective tissue, and part of the root sheath arises from cells, modified epithelial cells. But I don't want you to worry too much about that. There's just like a cylindrical enclosure around the growing and forming hair shaft as it starts to rise up through the parts of the hair follicle and ultimately reaches the surface. The part of the areolar or connective tissue of the dermis that has all the blood vessels that feed this growing layer of cells, this hair matrix, is called the hair papilla. Just areolar connective tissue packed with blood vessels in there and growth factors that will keep things rolling in there. This appendage sticks way down in the deepest part of the dermis, and you can see hypodermis here in the vicinity, because the hair bulb is so far down in the dermis. We're almost to the hypodermis in this picture. There's just a picture, a cross section through part of the hair follicle, showing the hair shaft with its cortex, or its medulla, its cortex. I'm having a little dyslexia problem today. The medulla, the cortex, the cuticle, and then the parts of the root sheath of the hair follicle. You can see the erector pili muscle here too. Again, I don't know why artists always draw the hair shaft emerging perpendicular to the skin surface, which it would not be. It would be emerging at an oblique angle, and then when the erector pili muscles contract, that's when the hair will stand up and bunch up the tissue behind it and cause a goosebump to form. Associated with the hair follicles is the sebaceous gland. It's now become finally to some histology associated with hair, because I would like you to be able to recognize this hair follicle within a micrograph of skin, and it has a very characteristic look. Like if I showed you a picture, I'd probably make sure you could see the hair bulb, or the follicle bulb, I mean, which would be this rounded part. And possibly even let you see a pigmented part of the hair shaft itself inside the follicle, so you'd really know what you're looking at. But associated with the hair follicle is a gland called the sebaceous gland, and here you see it depicted in cartoon form. Here you see it in histological section. The cells of the sebaceous gland are very characteristic looking. They are clear in comparison with many of the cells around them, and that's because their mucus or oil-rich secretion, I should say, washes out during the staining process for the most part. But the nuclei are very, very small, so you wind up with this really clear, hollow-looking space with a tiny dot of nucleus. So that's the peculiar look of sebaceous gland cells, and they produce the oily secretion that enters the follicle and then emerges onto the surface to lubricate the hair and the epidermis, the surface of the skin. If we look deep in the dermis, we'll also see some, in most parts of the skin, around most parts of the body, we'll also see some eccrine sweat glands. And eccrine sweat glands are like a ball of tubules all raveled up like a strand of spaghetti into a coil, and they're made up of simple cuboidal epithelial cells that secrete sweat. So the sweat is secreted into a duct ultimately, and we see it here, that pumps the sweat up onto the surface of the epidermis, hence the name, the classification of this as an exocrine gland. So this is how it would look in histological section. You'd see all these unusual shapes where you've cut the parts of the sort of raveled up coil of secretory structures at all different angles. But you can see the simple cuboidal cells are depicted here. If you really look carefully, you can find one that has part of a duct visible in it like this, which is pretty cool. So it's part of the duct that will carry the sweat out to the surface. On the soles of the feet and the palms of the hand, there are extremely deep undulations of the boundary between the epidermis and the dermis, and producing what are called either dermal ridges or epidermal ridges, which are much more coarse undulations than normally seen in the papillary dermis. And those give rise to what are called friction ridges on the surface of your skin. So your fingerprints are what are called friction ridges. So they tend to wick away water, or give it a channel away water. As you grip things, give you more ability to grasp objects and so forth. They're also obviously used forensically for individual identification. But you can see really cool, you can see the outlets of the ducts of the sweat glands here on these ridges that again come from the arrangement of the dermis and the epidermis. So you can't get rid of these things. They arise right from the way the two types of tissue form their boundary in the deep epidermis of the skin. And here's just a couple of illustrations of patterns of friction ridges in fingerprints, and I'm not interested in having you study that for this exercise. If you study Introduction to Forensic Science, or maybe some more advanced forensic science courses, or criminal justice courses, you'll learn a lot more about friction ridges and how to identify them and classify them and so forth. So in the next section, we'll take a look at the structure of bone tissue and how long bones in your appendages, your arms and legs, grow longer as you increase in stature during adolescence and so forth. So join me for that next recording.